For years, it was billed as the inevitable future. Green hydrogen, the zero-emissions fuel, poised to transform Australia into a global, renewable superpower, exporting clean energy to Asia and Europe. Leaders and investors pinned billions on this dream, promising a green replacement for fossil fuel exports. But now, the global dream of Australian green hydrogen exports, backed by billions in investment, has violently collapsed, forcing a painful reckoning with brutal economic reality.
Wow. That statement, and it comes straight from the sources you shared with us, it really pulls no punches, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't. It paints a pretty stark picture.
It really does. We're talking about this huge, ambitious industrial dream that seems to have, well, crashed headfirst into reality. So our mission today is to do a deep dive using these sources into this collapse. We want to impartially unpack what happened, figure out the hard economic facts and, the logistical hurdles that caused such a swift change, and see where Australia's hydrogen strategy might be pivoting now. Right. And what's really fascinating here, I think, is that this isn't just about politics or even a simple tech failure. It's a major lesson in techno-economics.
Techno-economics. Explain that a bit.
Well, the ambition was enormous. I mean, trying to replace Australia's $200 billion a year fossil fuel export industry with green energy, that's huge. But the analysis in these sources, it confirms that some really fundamental economic and logistical barriers were either perhaps ignored or just seriously underestimated. We really need to look at why those big multi-billion-dollar numbers just didn't stack up.
Okay, let's get into that. The speed and the scale of this retreat, it seems quite dramatic. The sources point to a really rapid series of, failures and major scalebacks, mostly between 2024 and 2025. Just how big was this industrial reversal?
Staggering is probably the right word. We saw projects valued in the tens of billions either outright canceled or put on ice indefinitely.
Tens of billions.
Yeah. For instance, in Queensland, there was the government-backed CQH2 export project. Huge potential investment, around $12.5 billion intended. That was basically scrapped. The developers pointed to costs just ballooning and serious doubts about whether it could ever be profitable long-term.
Okay, one major project down.
And it wasn't isolated. BP announced it was pulling out as operator and equity holder in the huge Australian renewable energy hub AREH. That was meant to be one of the biggest green energy projects in the region.
Right, I remember the AREH hype. So that's hitting the big international players too.
Absolutely. And the sources also highlight how quickly this impacted even the biggest champions of hydrogen.
Like who?
Well, take Fortescue. They were probably one of the most aggressive global backers of green hydrogen, right?
Definitely. Front and center.
They were forced to scale back dramatically. They shelved planned projects in the Northern Territory, even in the U.S., and maybe most symbolically, they opened that $150 million green hydrogen facility in Gladstone with a lot of fanfare in April 2024.
Yes, I remember seeing that.
It's now sitting silent, less than a year later, just idle.
Wow. That's incredibly fast. And it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, is it? This affects whole communities. The sources mention locals, like Chris Skirman in Gladstone. He remembers all the excitement, talk of billions and billions of dollars worth of construction. And now there's just uncertainty.
Exactly. It shows the reversal wasn't just theoretical. It hit hard on the ground very quickly.
And importantly, you touched on this, it isn't just an Australian issue. The sources confirm similar projects are being downsized or rethought in Canada, the U.S., Europe.
Which really suggests the core problem isn't specific to Australia's situation, its climate or politics. It seems baked into the economics of exporting hydrogen as energy itself.
Okay, so let's dig into those economics. The technology works, right? Electrolysis, splitting water with electricity, that's established. So why is the basic math so, devastating for the export dream? What are the big roadblocks making it so much more expensive?
Cost. It really boils down to cost. That gap is the single biggest factor. Right now, green hydrogen is somewhere between 300% and 700% more expensive than hydrogen made the traditional way, from gas or coal.
3 to 7 times more expensive.
Yes. In Australia, the sources put the cost around AUD $5 to $6 per kilogram. The target for it to be commercially viable, the government's own target, is $2 per kilogram. We're nowhere near that.
It's a huge gap. Is closing it just a matter of time and R&D, or is there something more fundamental going on, or maybe misjudging how efficient this process can actually become?
That really hits the nail on the head. I think the fundamental issue and how we should probably frame this whole discussion is that this entire export dream was built on a bit of a misconception. that hydrogen could be a cheap general energy carrier, like oil or natural gas.
But it's not.
The economics just don't support that view, at least not currently. Maybe not ever for export. Hydrogen is intrinsically expensive to make green because you need massive amounts of cheap, clean electricity, solar or wind, to power the electrolyzers, those machines that split the water. That electricity is the main cost driver.
Okay, so the input cost, the clean energy needed, is just too high right now. But even if you somehow solved that, made it cheaper to produce, you then hit the export problem. Getting it overseas sounds like another major hurdle.
A massive one, yeah. Even if you made it cheaply here, the cost of shipping it is immense. You basically have two options, and neither is great for bulk energy transport. You can ship it as a liquid, LH2. But that means cooling it down to an incredibly cold -253 degrees Celsius.
Minus 253.
Yeah, extremely cold. That needs very specialized, very expensive cryogenic tanks. And even then, you get significant boil-off losses during the journey. Basically, some of your product evaporates.
Okay, that sounds challenging. What's the other option?
Convert it into something easier to ship, like green ammonia. But that conversion process itself uses a lot of energy, adds complexity, and the sources show that when you factor everything in, shipping green ammonia as an energy carrier can end up being up to 10 times the cost of shipping LNG, liquefied natural gas, for the same amount of energy delivered.
10 times the cost of LNG. Ouch. Okay.
Right. It just kills the economics for using it as a bulk energy replacement for fossil fuels overseas.
And that premium, that transport cost, it feeds right back into what the sources call the chicken and egg problem, doesn't it?
Precisely. Producers won't build these massive billion-dollar plants without guaranteed buyers willing to pay those high prices. But the potential buyers, industrial users, they won't commit to switching their processes, which involves expensive long-term engineering changes, unless they have a reliable, affordable supply locked in first.
And nobody wants to move first. Especially when, as the sources note, hydrogen currently makes up less than 1% of Australia's own energy use. The domestic demand just isn't there yet to build that initial scale.
Exactly. And if you're an investor looking at Australia, that domestic challenge is made worse by what's happening overseas with subsidies. Australia offers incentives, sure, around $2 per kilo, but that struggles against the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which can offer up to $3 per kilo.
Which is significantly more.
Significantly. And that difference basically acts like a vacuum-sucking potential investment away from Australian projects towards the U.S., making it even harder to get Australian projects off the ground and achieve cost reductions here.
Okay, so the economics are tough, the logistics are tougher. But the sources flag another critical constraint, one that's often overlooked, especially for a dry continent like Australia: water. This whole hydrogen dream wasn't just energy hungry, it was incredibly thirsty.
Yeah, water is a huge, potentially show-stopping bottleneck. The basic chemistry, electrolysis, needs 9 liters of highly purified water for every single kilogram of hydrogen produced.
9 liters per kilo. Yeah.
But that's just the direct water used in the chemical reaction. When you factor in everything else the water needed for purification to get it ultra-pure, the water used for cooling the equipment, other system losses, the total amount of water consumed climbs really fast.
How fast? What are the estimates?
Well, there's a bit of uncertainty, which is worrying in itself. The government's low-end estimate for total system consumption is around 30 liters per kilogram. But independent research cited in the sources, it suggests the figures could range much, much higher, potentially up to 310 liters per kilogram, depending on the specific technology used and, crucially, the location.
Wow, from 30 up to potentially 310 liters for just 1 kilo of hydrogen. That's a huge range, and the top end is enormous.
It is. And when you apply those consumption rates to Australia's original big ambition for 2050, the numbers become genuinely shocking.
What did that look like?
Well, the target was around 15 million tons of hydrogen production by 2050. If Australia had actually hit that target, depending on which water consumption figure you use, the low or the high end producing, that much hydrogen could consume somewhere between 7% and a staggering 72% of all the water currently used each year by every Australian household, farm, mine, and black coal power plant combined.
72%.
Up to 72%, yes, on the high estimate. Even the low estimate, 7% of total national consumption, is a really significant amount of water. The high end is just, well, it's clearly not sustainable in a country like Australia.
No kidding. That raises massive questions about competition for water, pitting this new industry directly against farming, against cities.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental resource constraint that seems to have been seriously downplayed in the initial hype.
Okay, so The grand vision of Australia as a green hydrogen export superpower seems to have collapsed under the weight of, basically, brutal economics, fiendishly difficult logistics, and these critical resource constraints like water. A painful reckoning, as the opening quote said. Where does the strategy pivot now? The sources suggest a shift, away from exporting hydrogen molecules towards maybe exporting products made with hydrogen.
That's exactly right. It's a pragmatic realignment. It's an acknowledgement, really, of hydrogen's true economic role, which seems to be primarily as an industrial feedstock, not a bulk energy source for export.
So less focus on shipping energy overseas.
Much less. The focus is shifting towards smaller, more realistic domestic uses first. Build up experience, build up guaranteed local demand, prove the model on a smaller scale.
And what are those key domestic uses?
The priority is shifting to areas where green hydrogen is pretty much essential for decarbonization, where just electrifying everything isn't an option. The two big ones mentioned are, first, ammonia production.
For fertilizers and explosives.
Exactly. Australia already produces a lot of ammonia using hydrogen made from fossil fuels. In fact, that uses about 85% of all hydrogen currently consumed in the country. So the idea is to swap out the gray or brown hydrogen with green hydrogen in those existing plants. That decarbonizes a major existing industry.
Okay, that makes sense. Use it where it's already used. What's the second one?
Green steel and iron. Instead of just digging up iron ore and shipping it overseas, the idea is to process it here in Australia using green hydrogen instead of coal as the reducing agent.
So you create a higher value product, low carbon steel or green iron, and export that instead of trying to export the hydrogen itself.
Precisely. You add value domestically and you completely sidestep the nightmare logistics and cost of shipping pure hydrogen or ammonia just for its energy content.
But governments haven't totally given up, have they? The source mentioned there's still significant funding allocated.
No, not a total abandonment. There's still that $4 billion in taxpayer support earmarked, mostly through production credits to help bridge the cost gap. And there's the ongoing joint program with Germany, the $660 million H2 Global Initiative.
What's the aim of that one?
That's specifically designed to try and secure international buyers and help make Australian green hydrogen, or its derivatives like ammonia, competitive for future trade, essentially underwriting some of the price difference. But the overall emphasis now is definitely on local certainty, domestic applications, and much more measured growth.
So a slow and steady approach.
That's the consensus view from the experts cited. Focus on intermediate, achievable projects first, like, say, replacing just 7% of the fossil hydrogen used in one existing ammonia plant. Learn from that. Scale up gradually. Avoid those gigantic leaps that characterize the collapsed export dream. And there's also an acceptance that some projects will fail along the way that's seen as almost a necessary part of developing any complex new industry.
Right, so looking back at this whole story, based on the sources, it really feels like a classic case of, perhaps, hype getting way ahead of the hard, undeniable economics. The technology wasn't necessarily the failure point.
No, not fundamentally.
It was the economics, the logistics, the resource constraints. And that forced this vital, probably painful, but ultimately necessary pivot back towards realism, even in a country like Australia that has abundant renewable resources.
Absolutely. And I think the fundamental misconception, the thread running through the collapse of that export dream, was treating hydrogen like it was the next oil or natural gas, a general, easily transportable energy commodity.
When its real value is more specific.
Exactly. The data, the economics, they all point towards its true value, lying almost exclusively as an industrial input, a feedstock, where it's chemically required for processes like making ammonia or steel, processes that are very hard to decarbonize just by plugging them into the grid.
Okay, and that brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive. The original Australian dream, the big export vision, it fundamentally required green hydrogen to become much cheaper to make and way easier to transport than it currently is, or maybe ever can be.
Right.
So given that one of the world's most resource-rich nations, blessed with incredible sun and wind potential, couldn't make the hydrogen export business model work, even with billions in subsidies, well, it raises a really important question. Should the rest of the world maybe rethink the whole idea of relying on large-scale hydrogen imports for their energy needs? Should the focus shift almost entirely towards 100% domestic electrification where possible, and using hydrogen only as a targeted industrial input produced locally where it's needed?
That's a question with enormous implications for future energy security, for global trade patterns, and for how we actually achieve decarbonization. Something definitely worth thinking about.